to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my co-host and daughter,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
This show is brought to you by the Open to Hope Foundation, as well as in partnership with the Compassionate Friends. Well, Heidi, we've got a really interesting topic today, and I know one that you and I have thought about a lot, and that's involved with men in grief. And we've got a couple of really dynamite men to introduce to you on the show today. But Heidi, talk a little bit about men in grief.
Okay, well, what my mom and I have found is that, you know, men oftentimes are doers. They like to fix things, they like to do things, and we've interviewed so many guys on our show, that have done things like, you know, renovating their house and having guys over, or to do it, or working on their car and having guys over, because they really like to be active.
Yeah, and we've really found that while women like to grieve face-to-face, men often like to grieve shoulder-to-shoulder, and they like to take action and do things and transform and make change. Not that women don't, and I don't want to generalize too much, but we've really seen a lot of men that have done great things with their loss. And we're going to have a couple of them on today. One is Gary Mendell, and he is with an organization called Shatterproof that he has started to shatter the stigma of drug abuse. And really, you're going to find some wonderful ideas. And he does that in the name of his son, Brian, and we appreciate all the work he's doing. And then we're going to have Chuck Collins on. And Chuck Collins is the president of the board of the National Compassionate Friends. We'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about his work. His daughter Tiffanie died of an infection while she was in college, and he and his wife have done work with that, and you'll be hearing about that. And he's also written a book about Tiffanie. So anyway, it's going to be a great show.
It is, and I'm excited to talk with men about how they transformed their losses and found hope again after the death of their children.
Absolutely. Well, Gary Mendell, thank you for being on the show today.
Hi, Gary.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, tell us a little bit about Brian, what happened, how you got into this action of forming Shatterproof.
Sure. Brian was my oldest son, and just before high school, like most children in this country, he experimented with alcohol and other drugs, and he grew dependent on them. And it got worse over the years, and he went to 8 different treatment programs.
Wow.
For addiction from the time he was 17 through age 25, and he seemed to be getting better. The last program he attended, after he was there, he did really well for a little over a year. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, he took his life.
Wow. And you, fast forward, that was 3 years ago.
Yes.
And fast forward, you decided to take some action about this, and tell us about that and Shatterproof.
To be honest, it was really an evolution. It wasn't that I woke up the week after Brian died.
No,
and
I
said,
think that's a good point.
Right.
That
It was
it's
really
not something you do right away.
Yeah, I think it all happened in phases. But the months after Brian died, it took me a couple months to get out of the house. And during that time, people from all over the country that knew Brian were calling me, writing me letters, emailing me about how Brian had helped them. And so I got the idea of starting a small charity. And really the thought was a small local charity.
Right.
And I decided to take some time off of work, develop a business plan for this small charity, and with the thought of.
Now you took some time off from work, and you had big work that you were doing. You're in the hotel business, and really.
Yeah, I have a company that we own and operate about 40 hotels around the country.
Wow.
But I have partners, and we had a good management team. So I asked them if they would keep running the business for a while, where I could have time to develop a business plan for a small local charity, get it going, and then try to get back to work sometime several months later. That was the plan. And when I started doing research for the small local charity, I learned some things that really struck me that I just didn't know when Brian was alive. I was always reading and learning, but I was always reading and learning how to help Brian. I wasn't thinking about what was going on in the country. Now I was thinking about how to help others, and I just was struck by some information that shocked me. I had no idea how many people were touched by this disease. If you had asked me 3 years ago how many people in my town, how many fathers in my town had a son who was addicted, I would have said, I'm it. There's probably a few others, but nobody talks about it, so I don't know who they are.
Right.
Because there's a stigma.
because of this shame and the stigma.
And how many people do deal with some?
25 million Americans are actively addicted today.
25 million Americans.
Which
That's
is 1
amazing.
in 10 above the age of 12.
Wow.
Which is, when you then put in family members around them,
Yeah.
that's 1/4 of American families.
Right.
Right.
Huge.
1/4 of American families, someone in that home is actively addicted.
Wow.
And it's also the 3rd largest cause of death in the country.
Wow.
Every single day, 350 Americans die related to alcohol or other drugs.
That's incredible.
Every day.
Absolutely incredible.
So that struck me.
You know, just let me stop for 1 minute because I
Sure.
know Heidi had a father-in-law
Right.
who was an alcoholic who later recovered, but I had 5 uncles and aunts that were alcoholics on my dad's side, 10 kids. So when you say that, it just strikes home for me that here we are, the 3 of us sitting here, and it's really touched all of us.
Absolutely.
It is just shocking how big it is. And really, the action steps in this country to correct something so big are not there.
Right. Well, and people say, just say no. And it's not that easy. I mean, look at your son. He was in 8 different treatment programs over his lifetime. And there were times where he was able to maintain sobriety and other times where he couldn't. It wasn't just that easy. It wasn't about willpower.
One time I went to punish him, and he said, "Dad, you don't have to punish me.
He's probably punishing himself,
This
right?
is punishment enough."
Yeah.
Wow. Incredible. Talk about some of the physical aspects of it, because I know on your site on Shatterproof, we were talking a little earlier, it's kind of fascinating that people really haven't focused in on the brain changes that happen. I mean, it's not this willpower, you know, you should have more willpower or whatever, just head to AA or whatever. They've got some brain changes, particularly with kids, right?
Well, I don't know. The changes happen mostly during childhood. The reality is that those 25 million Americans, 8 out of 10 became addicted before their 18th birthday. Your brain is still developing until your mid-20s, and it's so susceptible at that point to becoming addicted. And that's most often, not all the time, that's when addiction develops, you know, before the age of the early 20s, and most often before the age of 18.
Interesting.
And brain scans that we have now that didn't exist 10 years ago clearly show the difference between an addicted brain and a non-addicted brain. And it's important for everyone to know it's not black or white. There's a lot of gray in between.
Right.
And by that I mean there's heavily addicted, there's
Right.
lightly addicted, there's in the middle.
There's
for some
not
people,
as functional, there's highly functional.
Yeah, I've met many people that said, I was addicted, one day I just stopped.
Wow. My
Yeah.
father-in-law did that. I
And I've
mean, he drank for years, and then he was, you know, he started getting severe liver damage, and he got really scared, and he was much older at this point in his life. And I don't know how he was able to stop. He ended up dying of cirrhosis, but he was able to stop the last 7 years of his
and
life.
I've met people like that, but I've also met people that were staring at losing their family,
Yeah.
losing their
And they
job,
couldn't.
losing their house, losing their car, potentially losing their life, and they still took the drink.
Isn't that more common? I've heard a lot of more stories like that, where they really wanted to stop, but they just couldn't.
It is more common from the people I've talked to,
Yeah.
but I can't say statistically it's more common. There's both. But so I guess I just want to bring out the point. It's not either you're addicted or you're not addicted.
Right.
There's all
There's a continuum.
gradients.
Yeah.
There's all
and
gradients.
we're
of it.
talking about some brain damage too. I mean, there's just been some literature out lately that said that they looked at a study where some kids had 9-point lower IQ.
Yeah, that
who
study was done in Europe, and they looked at teens 4 years, I think 3 or 4 years later,
Wow.
and there was about an 8.5-point difference in IQ
In the
between
heavy
one
users, yeah.
related to using marijuana.
That's amazing.
Well, let me ask you, because I want to make sure we cover this. Talk about Shatterproof, what your hopes are for it, what your dreams are, what you're planning, and talk about the Shatterproof Challenge, because
Yeah,
we're
I
going to
love
show a
it.
little video right now.
Sure. Another thing that really struck me, and I was referring to before, was for every major disease in this country, there's one well-funded national organization that has done wonderful good for society, saving a lot of lives. Think of American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, Autism Speaks.
Yeah.
And it struck me when I was studying this that for addiction, there was no such organization. Here you have the 3rd largest cause of death in the country, 4th most prevalent disease in the country, And there's no well-funded organization that does the type of things that those organizations do, which are really three things: funding for research, advocacy, and information and support for families. And so the vision of Shatterproof is to be that for addiction, which is so sorely needed by so many people.
Yeah.
And the sequel, to the next step to that was I studied those organizations, and one of the biggest things I saw was uniting and empowering millions of Americans and thousands of communities around the country to engage in their cause. Whether it's a breast cancer walk, whether it's donating, whether it's advocating, whether it's volunteering, whether it's going to the website and learning about the disease, destigmatizing the disease. And so I knew to reach that vision of what we wanted to be, the American Cancer Society of Addiction, we had to be strong in events. In events, I mean American Cancer, American Heart, Susan Komen, et cetera. And so we chose, coming out of the real estate business as I did, we were looking for something different and unique.
Right.
We knew our first couple of years, how do you get people to pay attention to addiction? It's not going to probably be with a walk that everyone else is doing your first couple of years. It might be down the road, but how do you make a change in society to get people to think about what you're doing and bring attention to it? So the idea came up of rappelling off of buildings.
I love that idea.
Well, let's show that video, and then we're going to introduce Chuck Collins, and then I want to interview you and Chuck together about some of your hopes and dreams, and let people know what they can do to help your organizations.
Thank you.
So let's watch that video of rappelling off of buildings, I believe.
There are 25 million Americans actively addicted to alcohol and other drugs. We are coming together to increase awareness and funding for the prevention, treatment, and recovery of this disease.
I'm rappelling for my son, Paul.
I'm rappelling for my dad.
To support that my son is an addict.
I'm rappelling for my sister-in-law.
That was awesome!
Go Shatterproof!
Go Shatterproof!
So before we start, I just wanted to say that Chuck and I work very closely together, because Chuck is the president of the National Board of Directors for the Compassionate Friends. So he has given hundreds and hundreds of hours of volunteer time as a tribute to his daughter, Tiffanie, and to help all those bereaved parents out there find hope again. So thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
I love working with you.
Absolutely. I've been on the board with Chuck, and it's been pretty amazing experience and wonderful. But before we get to the Compassionate Friends, Chuck, talk a little bit about Tiffanie and what happened with her and some of the things you and your wife have done.
Well, Tiffanie was 19 years old. She was 13 days shy of 20. She was a student at Clemson University. And all seemed well. And the only symptoms she had was a sore throat. And in the process of a weekend, she went from a sore throat to being hospitalized. And 3 days later, she died of bacterial meningitis.
That's amazing.
We discovered that that was a condition. That's an infection that affects people who live in close environments. The military inoculates for it, and prisons inoculate for it.
Wow.
But at that time, the colleges were not. And so as a result of that...
And what year was this? How long
This was 1996.
Okay.
And so at that time, they weren't really saying much about bacterial meningitis at the college level. And so my wife Kathy began following the National Meningitis Association and learned a lot from them in terms of what could be done. And I encourage any family that has college-age children to go and pay attention to the National Meningitis Association. They're on Facebook. They have a great, they will constantly update you on the latest updates as far as meningitis goes. For example, Tiffanie died of the C strain of meningitis, for which there was a vaccine. If anybody had told her that there had been 4 other cases of meningitis in the Clemson area, she would have taken it.
Oh my gosh.
But of course that information never got to her. But the B strain was one for which there was no vaccine at the time. And over the last year, it hit Princeton University, it hit University of California, Santa Barbara. And so they went out and did some research, and they came up with a B strain. They had to go outside the country, and it was recently approved. But it's important that you have to protect your children, and we dads know that. We're raised to believe we have to protect our children, and so anyone that's got college-age children should pay attention to the national
Are there some
meningitis.
signs, too, that it's meningitis?
One of the ones that, we had in the morning with Tiffany was neck pain.
Neck pain.
And that's supposed to be a very common sign. And yet it came at the very end for us. It didn't really, we had no warning. Ours was just a sore throat.
Okay.
And but sometimes it's neck pain, sometimes it's weakness. They get very weak. Tiffany got very weak to the point where I had to help her down the steps. We thought she had the flu. They're very flu-like symptoms.
I was going to say that's what it seems like, right? Is the
Right.
flu.
They're very flu-like symptoms, and but it is something you have to be very, very
Isn't there
careful
something
with.
about being able to go like this? Or is that a myth?
I think it's just the neck pain. I think it's just the neck discomfort.
Okay,
that,
and it's the neck discomfort.
So, Chuck, fast forward, you and your wife got involved with the Compassionate Friends. And tell us about the Compassionate Friends. How did you get involved?
Compassionate Friends was something, I had been an old cop. We don't do support groups. So when somebody said, let's go to the Compassionate Friends, you two need to go to the Compassionate Friends. We had never heard of it, we didn't know anything about it. But within 2 weeks, we went to the first meeting. I actually got commandeered in the parking lot by the chapter leader, which is the only way I got in there.
Wow.
But in the process, I was really glad that I did, because there were moms and dads in there, brothers and sisters and grandparents, telling what happened to them. This is basically mentors. These are parents that have survived. Most important thing you see when you walk through that door, these are people who lost a loved one and they survived it.
Yeah.
At a time when you're not sure. To see that is huge, and then to hear the issues that their experiences that they're going through, and they're the same kind of things that you think you're going crazy,
Totally.
in your life, and then to hear them explain what they've been through is just incredible. And
And
so
it
the bond that
normalizes it for you, probably. And you think, well, wow, I'm not going crazy. Other people have been on this path and made it. I'm going to make it.
It's absolutely true, and you form a bond in there that is just unbreakable in terms of you get phone numbers of people you can call night or day. Obviously you're very depressed in the very, very beginning, and these are people that give you hope. I mean, you go to these Compassionate Friends meetings. We have 692 chapters around the country, and they meet at least once a month. Some of them meet more frequently than that, and there's no cost to go to a Compassionate Friends meeting. So anyone who's lost a child, a sibling, or grandchild is welcome to go to those meetings.
And you can also go to the National Conference, which is fabulous, and it's in July every year, and Heidi and I will be presenting, and you'll be doing things there, and Gary, I think you're going to come too. It's going to be a great meeting. Well, I want to mention your book too. You wrote this great book, Holding On to Love, Searching for Hope When a Child Dies. Yeah.
That actually was a product of, I was a chapter leader for 5 years, and as a process of being a chapter leader, there were so many things that parents were curious about when they go to these meetings. They would ask so many questions, and there were times where you worry about parents. I would see some parents come through and they would have the same behavior I had, because I wasn't sure about tomorrow when I went to my first meeting. And I would see some come through that they weren't too sure about theirs. And so by loaning them a book from our library at the chapter, I could say, look, how about taking a look at this particular chapter? And I'll call you on it. We can have coffee, or but that way, that was my hook to make sure they came back next month in the process. And every one of these chapters is very short, because when you're grieving, you have a short attention span, as you two know.
Yeah.
And so, but it's broken down by topic in such a way that it helps them depending upon what their problem is.
Fabulous. Well, tell me, are there a lot of men at the groups, and what about men in grief? And let's get together and talk with Gary about this too.
Yeah.
Gary, you're only 3 years out, right? Which is really, in the world of grief and loss, particularly for a child, that's not a long time. And our heart totally goes out to you for what you're going through right now. And Chuck, it's been how many years for you?
It'll be 19 in May for me.
Yeah.
So I'm at the other end of the spectrum.
What do you guys make of men in grief? I mean, do guys talk to each other? What's going on?
I think what we used to do is we would break it. Normally it's a mixed group, and when I first started going, it was predominantly women. And by the time I stepped down, it was at least a third men every month that were coming. And so we break up into groups, and every once in a while, and the women would be in one room, and the men would be in the other room, and the men would talk about their grief and what they're going through, and the women would talk about the men.
I love that.
Which is, I think it's true. Why isn't my husband crying more?
Right.
Why isn't he talking about it more? It's interesting, the crying thing, because Bob Bauer, a friend of ours, a psychologist, has done a lot on crying, and he went to Africa at one time. And so I had to teach his course for him. So I learned a lot about crying. One of the things I learned was that women are really predisposed to cry hormonally because they produce oxytocin. So there's a natural predilection for women to cry more than men do. You know, but not to say that men don't cry, but sometimes it comes a little easier and they're wondering what the guys are. How did you find it, Gary? I mean, you had some really supportive colleagues at work because they were able to help you take over, right?
Yeah, that was more supporting me from taking over work, but I never really thought about a distinction between a man and a woman, you know, male and female. To me, I could be wrong. I mean, in fact, I'm sure I am because I know you two know more. But you know, because you see the differences in men and women. For me, it was more everyone grieves differently.
Yeah, it's true.
It wasn't a gender thing. I think everyone grieves differently. I had wonderful support from my wife, who's here, and my entire family, and everyone's different. You know, Brian's mother grieve differently than I grieve differently. Our kids all grieve differently. Everyone's different.
Yeah. Oh, that's one that I think is difficult too. Is you do grieve differently. I remember sometimes I'd feel after our son died, I'd feel like I'm going to get up and I'm really going to make it today. And then I'd look at my husband and he'd be really sad. It wouldn't be one of his make it days. And then he'd feel like he wanted to make it and I would be sad that day. And it's, you know.
Or when you're both really sad and you're feeling like, okay, I really need somebody to be strong for me.
Right.
Because I don't want to both be in this space.
Yeah. And then Heidi comes in for the siblings because your son had siblings, right?
Yes.
And I know your daughter has a couple of brothers. What about the siblings?
Well, I think Gary's making a good point. Even within gender, there's a lot of difference. And I think the difficult part is, I don't want to say it's a problem, but the difficult part is that oftentimes we're all grieving differently and maybe we all want different things. And within a family, how do you compromise? If my mom wants to bake a cake for my brother's birthday to celebrate, to pay tribute to him and honor him, I might not want that. That might be too difficult for me with the family singing to nobody. You know, they're singing to his memory.
Right.
And so you see that a lot. When I work with families, I see that a lot. We have to figure out how do we compromise. And what happens when parents don't want to celebrate the holidays, but their kids are like, wait a minute, what about us? I mean, you had little kids, and I don't know how old yours were, but your sons were fairly young.
We went through that, especially for Christmas, because Tiffany loved Christmas. And so the last thing we wanted to do was to celebrate Christmas, but we have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. And so we were very blessed to have friends in Las Vegas who invited us out. And so we went to Las Vegas where it looks like Christmas all year round. So it's, you know, you can kind of forget that it's Christmas while you're there. And so we did that 2 years. You know, they were great to allow us to come out there.
I love that idea.
But then didn't you tell me that your son said, come on, Dad, let's have Christmas?
Well, one of my sons decided that he missed Christmas. And so the third year out, we did. In fact, we had in our development, we have a prize. I give a ham for the house that's lit up the most. And so I got them involved, and my wife got them involved in us decorating our house, and it was like atrocious. I mean, there were lights everywhere. We were blowing fuses left and right.
Oh, that's funny.
And but we won the ham. So, but it got them engaged and it got them involved.
Yeah, there's a guy doing. I still hear you guys doing action, Shatterproof. You're doing your you know, head of the board of Compassionate Friends. You were, you know, chapter leader, and you're doing, you know, your thing. So I want to ask you both, what are your hopes and dreams, and what would you like our audience to know about the future? How would you like them to dial in? Do you know more about you? Why don't you start, Chuck?
Well, I guess what I would want to make sure...
And take a look at those guys and tell them out there.
I guess what I would want everyone to know is that there is a Compassionate Friends. And it's really important. You know, you're going to know somebody sooner or later who loses a child, a sibling, or a grandchild. And this is a safe place for you to send them. We get referrals from ministers and religious clergy because, you know, when a parent loses a child, they're really not anxious to hear that, you know, God has a plan. And so by going to these meetings and talking to other parents and siblings and grandparents that have lost a child, they can rediscover hope in their lives. This is out there. It doesn't cost them anything to go to these meetings. And so please, www.compassionfriends.org, if you would write that website down so that you could refer someone anytime, because you never know when you're going to need it.
All right, thanks, Chuck. Gary, and
Thank
you.
you.
There they are waiting for you. Give them the pitch.
Well, I would echo what Chuck said. I went to many support groups after my son Brian passed away, and I found it really, really helpful. So no one can really understand what you're going through except for other people are going through at the same time. And so I would really recommend that you all, and that anyone who's had a loss, look up Compassionate Friends, The Compassionate Friends, as Chuck said. It's a wonderful organization, and I know, and support groups really, really help me a lot. As far as what I'm involved with Shatterproof, it's trying to prevent human suffering related to addiction. And you know, the other organizations I mentioned earlier, whether it's American Heart, American Cancer, have done enormous good for society, preventing people from dying. And that's what our organization is about, to put in programs that are already existing today, that are sitting in medical journals, and get them out into use to prevent our children from becoming addicted. And then equally important, for those who are addicted, let's unite as a country and get rid of the stigma and the shame for Americans who have a disease. The shame needs to go away, and that's what we're about.
Now, they can go on your site at Shatterproof.
Yes.
And now, are you having challenges, more challenges for people,
Yes,
or
we've
activities?
Yes, thank you. We've just, for 2015, we're doubling the number. We're going from 14 to 30 events this year around the country.
Wow.
You can learn about them on www.shatterproof.org. It's a Shatterproof Challenge. And for those who want to engage in this cause related to prevention, treatment, and recovery of addiction, it's a wonderful place to come to unite with others, have a lot of fun, and be out there on the rooftops ending the stigma of this disease. That's what it's about. It's not hiding and shame. It's coming out in public and talking about this as a disease.
You know, one thing I really liked about looking at that Shatterproof challenge that you had, and about Compassionate Friends too, is Heidi and I have said that you really grieve in community. We've never grieved alone. One of our people on our radio show last week said there should be a big sign that says, what was it, danger, grieving should not be done alone.
Yeah.
Hazardous.
Yeah.
Hazardous grieving should not be done alone.
So true.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the way you both bring people to community, and when I saw your Shatterproof challenge things, I thought it was so intriguing, because everybody was saying, I'm repelling for Joe, I'm doing this for, you know, whatever, and I just thought it was
And everybody was cheering people on, and they do the same at Compassionate Friends with our walks. I mean, you're all together in community cheering people on and being there and paying tribute and honoring and celebrating the life of our loved ones. Because it's the life that we want everybody to remember. It's not the way that they died, it's the way that they lived.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much for being on the show, and thank you for all the work you're doing with Compassionate Friends and with Shatterproof. And we want to say to all of you, thanks for watching our show today. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with Dr. Heidi Horsley. And Heidi and I want to say to you, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours till you find your own, and God bless.